Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This week we are joined with a special guest host. Dr. Dario Nardi is here with us on the show. Welcome to Personality Hacker, Dr. Nardi.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So we've been recording a series of podcasts on type development, which is the sequence of development or focus of growth that a person ideally would be walking through when it comes to their cognitive function stack. And this includes the 4 shadow functions as well, functions 1 through 8. What's the ideal way a person would flow through these functions to, make sure that they're not becoming too one-sided, to make sure that they are taking advantage of all developmental opportunities. And in large part, these podcasts have been, sort of developed or leaning on the work of Dr. Dario Nardi, who is with us as co-host this week, in your book, Magic Diamond. And as we've been talking about this, in a recent Profiler training question and answer session, one of our students asked, well, how do you know that you've developed your auxiliary function enough? Or in the car model of the co-pilot, like that's the thing that we always hear at Personality Hacker talk about is like, what's the biggest bang for the buck? Well, go to your co-pilot or auxiliary function. But how do you know that is developed enough to keep working through to the other functions? So that's the conversation we want to talk a little about today is how does one know if one's function is developed sufficiently in order to move to the next function?
Well, the question I would have, and Dr. Nardi, you might want to jump in here on this, is what do we even mean when we talk about function development? Like, what is that? What's actually happening there when we talk about developing a cognitive function in our personality?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's, one way to look at it, the way Dr. Jung looked at it, C.G. Jung, was that people start off undifferentiated. They might have a propensity, but essentially there's like clay. And what is the clay going to become? And we can work with the clay in a particular direction to form, to give life to, make personal our particular version of, say, extroverted thinking or introverted sensing or whatnot. And as we give life to it and grow it and develop it, it becomes differentiated. And that is not the end of the story, because we can differentiate something, like we can create something with clay and put it on a shelf, but it's not integrated into our lives. It's like a set piece. So how do we then, as we differentiate further, bring it back and integrate it into the rest of our lives? So he saw individuation as this broad process that includes both differentiation and integration. And we see this in the brain, just to sort of this last part to say, that when you look at, say, an infant or young child in their brain, what you see is a lot of regional areas, regional networks that are starting to blossom and develop like little individual flowers, flower beds in a garden, but they aren't interconnected yet. And it takes time for those networks to interconnect, and then a paring down process happens, and the person sort of optimizes, and then they grow up and they become teenagers and like, oh my God, I have to restart the process all over again. Mm-hmm. So there really is a lot of broad neurological evidence for what Jung talked about, and that's essentially what it means to develop a function, is to make it our own, to differentiate it, and then to bring it back into the rest of who we are.
So I like this idea that a function is developed almost once it's been personalized and then integrated in your life enough so that you're implementing it. But I think also this idea of differentiation isn't just personalizing it to yourself. I would think that there would also be sort of implicit in that process is the idea that once you're personalizing it to yourself, you're also now having to bring it as a way to overcome challenges in your world. Like that's part of the personalization process, is that I'm bringing this tool to the world and the world is going to throw a bunch of challenges at me, and I'm going to grab all the tools that I can in order to help solve those problems. And so if I'm actually integrating it in my life, which means that I'm implementing it in my life as well, then it itself is going to change and alter as it becomes something that I'm leaning on in order to get through these problems or to solve these challenges. So I would think that a piece of sort of function development is also basically almost like how we as individuals or as humans grow and develop. We do that by throwing ourselves in front of challenges and problems and then solving them and overcoming them and getting to the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Jung used the phrase psychological types and this idea of the psyche. Psyche does not mean just, computation inside my head. So I know people like to use terms now like cognitive processes. I too use that at times, cognitive functions and whatnot. And while they might sound a little bit more scientific, they miss the very thing that you're saying, which is that the development occurs with respect to the world. Jung talked about how a person can become one-sided. In other words, overusing one function, underusing another. And it isn't necessarily something happening in their mind that's missing or overdone. It's in the world, in practical life. Like the person forgot to pay attention to really important sensory stuff like shelter and food and money is saving for the future and whatnot. And then that, in a sense, is them neglecting their sensing function. So he didn't mean it as behavioral, but he's like the psyche is the whole system, including the inside and the outside of the person.
Yeah. And so then the question becomes, particularly as we talk about, the recommendation is to make sure that your dominant function is healthy. We always say you'll know that your dominant function has been well integrated in your life when your life is ergonomically designed to make sure that you can access it and develop it and grow it as much as possible. And then, after your dominant function, if you make sure you have a healthy, strong relationship with that, then you go to your second function. Then it's a combination of balancing the second and the third function together. And then based on your recommendations, and I've seen this in coaching so much, is the importance of developing the sixth function. And so in all of these, that's the map, but how do you know you've spent enough time at each mile marker in the map? Like, what does it look like, maybe in your opinion, Dario, that a function is well developed enough in order to know that maybe I'm hitting a law of diminishing returns and it's time for me to move my attention to the next function?
Can I jump in here and say that my metric is when the tears stopped?
Yeah.
I remember trying to grow my auxiliary function, introverted feeling. I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. And I remember resisting it so much. I mean, literal tears would come. I'd be so frustrated and angry that I had to go here and work on this. Mm-hmm. And I remember just thinking, man, all of my old strategies fell by the wayside. And I had to start to focus on something that wasn't the common go-to tool often. And I remember how traumatizing it was. This is 8 years ago when I really focused on this. Again, that's not a good answer when the crying stops, but I think there is a sense of resistance sometimes to going these places. And that, for me, the resistance not being there was a big metric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe a lot of people can relate to that. Even for me, my auxiliary is extroverted thinking, which is sort of socially expected and very practical. There are times when I'm like, ugh, really? Again, I have to attend to this every day? How many times do I need to balance my checkbook? It never ends. Can't I go just, daydream somewhere? And so I get that. And yet at the same time, as you folks in Personality Hacker have pointed out, that when we do give attention to the auxiliary and grow it, we get such benefits from it. And I can certainly see that. I mean, there are problems which have bothered me for months, not big ones, but, things that are there in the background. And sometimes literally it was 5 minutes of extroverted thinking that fixed it. And I'm like, why didn't I just do that before?
Right.
So very much, I think in terms of underdoing, we really do look at that. And now the question is, especially when there are more tools now to sort of coach people on how do I develop this function, activities that they can do and so on. How do I know I'm progressing? Or maybe I'm missing something, I thought it was developed and it actually, there's a big hole.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why it's so good to get a strong relationship to what these functions look like, sort of as a foundational component, on a principle level. And then that piece about the differentiation, which is, and then how am I using it? And where are my opportunities to maybe take some of those principled level, sort of understandings about this function and then apply it to my personal life? Like you said, where are opportunities where I'm not implementing it? I always think of it as leaving money on the table. Like, where am I leaving money on the table when it comes to this function?
Yeah. By the way, if you're a new listener and you just joined us for the first time, you might want to get a little bit of a reference experience or a reference point for this. Head over to personalityhacker.com, and we've laid out functions for each personality type. So if you look for your personality type, you'll see how this plays out for you in what we call the CAR model, just to see the first 4 functions in what's technically called your cognitive function stack. So you might want to check that out if you're a new listener. Anyway, didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to make sure I point people that are new.
I know.
No, that's important. Yeah.
So what were we talking about again?
You were just talking about how kind of having a good working framework for how this looks.
Right. So the idea of realizing that there's almost always more to fillet out. There's almost always more to be able to, like, particularly with me as an ENTP, having introverted thinking as my auxiliary function or my second function. It's there's always more that I can do to sharpen that. I think I'm realizing that, but there was a moment when I realized that I think it's time for me to move on. I think, like, spending all of my time and effort really focused and honing in on this as my current developmental process, that might be, like, I think I might have hit that law of diminishing returns. And I think for me, it was when I was trying to use it. And by the way, the more I developed that second function, the more it sort of organically encouraged me to see more of facets and assets that I could pull on with my first function as well. And so the two of them became sort of a powerhouse together. And that was when I felt like the most, superhero-like, when I was like, oh my gosh, these two together are so amazing. But then I got to a moment when I realized that those two functions together were not solving all of my challenges. Like, there was a bunch of things that those two together were not the right tool for the job, even in connection with each other or even like supporting each other. And that was the moment that I realized that maybe I need to lean on other strengths, or maybe develop other strengths or balances in order to solve some of the challenges that, say, an ENTP naturally isn't designed to solve.
Yeah. Do you have an example off the top of your head of one of those things? Would it be like in more of a social role, because you need to pull on maybe your 10-year-old tertiary of extroverted feeling, and so you felt like your two primary functions aren't going to really help you there? Is that an example maybe?
Yeah, I can think of two different ways. The first is that, I really started focusing on that second function 10 years ago in order to leave a paradigm behind that actually wasn't gelling with what made sense to me. And so I spent a lot of time and effort reevaluating my thought processes and my beliefs, and going through and looking at what I now call the coding of my mind, and trying to figure out which lines of script are ones that I still wanted to keep and which ones I wanted to give away. And that required like a heightened level of radical honesty, both with myself and the outside world. And I started getting to a place where I could recognize when I was lying to myself a lot, and maybe when I was misrepresenting myself to the outside world. And so becoming radically honest was like super important to me. And I also was doing a lot of teaching during that time. And so I got better and better at understanding systems and breaking them down and being able to teach them to other people. But there was a moment when first I realized that radical honesty is not always the right tool for the job, particularly when you're communicating with somebody you're coaching, because they're just not at a point right in this moment that they can hear this level of sort of penetrating surgical truth.
Gotcha.
And so something like there's more compassion that needs to be wrapped into it. But also I was realizing that my style of teaching is very oratory and very in the moment. But when I was creating content for other people, I was employing too much random access thinking. It was too introverted thinking. And that sixth function of extroverted thinking, which helped me realize that people need to understand things sort of built on top of each other. They need to understand concept A before they can move to B. That was a big game changer for me as well. And my two top functions were not conducive to me creating programs that walked people through a process. And so yeah, those were just moments when I'm like, I need to see the wisdom of other tools.
I think beforehand what came up, the answer we gave when we were doing the workshop, and then a little bit more brainstorming, is a half dozen different questions we can ask or distinctions we can make. Are we ready to move on, or have we done enough? And maybe we haven't, like what's left, what to do. That's the flip side of the question. And how about I just name them so that the viewer has like a table of contents, and
Yeah.
then we'll go through them. Yeah. So one of them, that number one, is this distinction that Jung made between barbarism versus civilization. Um, Number two is passive or basic use versus active advanced use. Number three is, are there visible products that others can see from using the function? Number four is, when using the process, it did work, but now all of a sudden it's not working, or there's some kind of surprise that it's happening. Number five, is the distance between that function and the others small or wide? Like if there's a really big distance in terms of development between the first and second, or the second and third, or whatnot, how is that showing up, and is it satisfying? And then the last is, there are different facets to each function, even our dominant function, and we may really get into developing one or two of those facets and maybe neglect, or three or four of them and neglect one of them. So I focus in particular on this analytic versus holistic facets now, or flavors, and that's a way to sort of help us gauge development. So those are 6 pieces, and we might think of more as we chat.
Yeah, I love the idea that of the third one, which is production other people can see. Because even when you're developing an introverted function, I mean, how we change as individuals is going to change how we show up. So it doesn't always have to be something, when you talk about the production, I don't see that as something that always has to have like a specific material change, like actual producing of something, but it can be an observable change in another person. And I think those changes, you start to change nodes and systems and you get different emergence. And so if we as individuals are altering and changing because maybe say we're developing an introverted function and that's changing who we are, we're going to bring that changed person out to the world. We're going to engage with people a little differently. We're going to look a little different, and we're going to make choices based on this newfound wisdom that will make, sort of that can be observed in the outside world. A choice that maybe 10 years ago would have been out of alignment, with what we see ourselves as, is now very much in alignment with us, because we've altered based on how we've changed internally.
Yeah. So an example might be for folks, let's say introverted feeling. I'll pick an introverted function because we might think, oh, well, that's introverted feeling is all just the interior, I don't want to say emotional, but feeling tone life of the individual, their identity, their conscience, their beliefs, their values. And oftentimes it shows up in a very quiet way or a hidden way. The person isn't going to push that onto others, except when they do. And yet it can show up in many ways. One is that there's a shift or reframe in the person's sort of one of their core values that changes their behavior. So going from, for example, from being aggressive on certain topics or with certain kinds of people or situations to being much more peaceful in those situations, like having an inner calm that they didn't have before. Second way is that, certainly as an introvert, I experience this is I love working on projects. They don't necessarily have to be creative projects. I mean, for me, they happen to be, but say you're ISTJ or the ISTP or whatnot, you're working on a project. It could be mechanical, could be fixing something, abstract, concrete, like whatever it is. Does the introverted function show up in the person's life in terms of something that they create or something that they do? And is that visible to others? So, introverted thinking can be used in a way that's just like critiquing that isn't shared with others. And then there's the introverted thinking that's used as part of a person's job or as a hobby or as a spiritual interest. It can also then end up being used in things like, well, what's a people technology for, say, managing workshops better or groups better? And does that come out in how the person is using the function? So I really believe all of them can have these visible products. And the way I got that term was through Steve Myers in the UK. No relationship to Isabel Myers, he's a Jungian scholar. And Jung talks about products as well. And Steve, in his practical life, has to pay attention to teams and advise on teams as a consultant. And so what are our team roles and how do those show up? So even the roles that we play, in a sense, that's a product. And are we playing those roles effectively?
So Antonia, this is very introverted thinking of you. You just jumped to the middle of the list and I'm going, wait, she's in the middle of the list. You got to go back to the beginning, to the first thing that Dr. Nardi said.
Yeah, you are totally right, because he mentioned 6 things. And I grabbed the one that was the most interesting to me in the moment. And as soon as I did that and started talking about production, which was like item number 3, my 6 function immediately went, you know that you're doing it out of order, right? And I was like, oh, I'm doing it again. So yeah, we can go back and look at each of those 6 things that Dario just mentioned in order.
Well, hey, and Dario, even the INTJ here was cool with it. He just rolled with it. He's like, all right, we're doing this, right?
Well, and I think I could roll with it because in my mind there's like a little a board with a checklist, of 6 things, and basically it's like, okay, we're doing number 3 right now. Check off number 3, and then if we do number 5 and then number 2 and 1, like I'm cool with that as long as there's some kind of reference point and way to track what we're doing. And that's, I guess that's where that chart the course interaction style comes in as well.
It's also a very INTJ patting the ENTP on the head. Like, there, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. Whereas it's interesting, just as a side note, my extroverted thinking, Dario, is, tenure tertiary, obviously, as an ENFP. And for me, I'm a little more childlike. I'm like, we have to go in the order. We can't just have the list and do it out of order. We got to go in the order. Otherwise, we'll lose track of what we're doing. Yeah. It's interesting to see how those functions show up even in this conversation.
Okay, route us back.
And in this case, I think that the order would matter had I actually thought to start and put them in a sequence that made sense, say, historically or conceptually. But it's more like a randomly generated list.
Exactly.
That I just attached numbers to for convenience.
There you go.
So it really doesn't actually matter what order we discuss them in. But no worries, I have them right in front of me visually, so we'll get to them.
It's all good. Well, let's go back to the first one you mentioned, though. Barbarism versus civilization. Like, that sounds like that's really extreme. Like, barbarism? Like, what in the world? Well, I mean, why is Jung making this comment?
Yeah, that's Jung's terminology, and there's a cute little quote that he has around that, and where he's using the terms in a little bit different way than we might think of them or use them today, but they're still very relevant. So he says a conscious capacity for one-sidedness. In other words, we're consciously choosing to be specialized or to do something in a certain way, to use only our right hand or only our left hand, is a sign of the highest culture. He's like, that's fine, we're doing this with awareness. But involuntary one-sidedness, the inability to be anything but using my right hand with my left hand tied behind my back or whatever it is a sign of barbarism. So he's really applying this at the psychological level and saying that when we're acting blindly, we have this involuntary one-sidedness. And sometimes, by the way, we may be aware of something, and that's actually not enough because we keep watching ourselves walk down the same avenue or do the same pattern over and over. So conscious capacity does, in fact, mean more than awareness. Yeah. It does, although that's a vital step. It means the capacity to choose. And if we look at a developmental model around competence, where there's these 2 dimensions of competent or not and then aware or not, that when we get really good at something, like I'm thinking when I play guitar, for example, I'm actually not putting a lot of conscious awareness into what my individual fingers are doing. That would actually be hazardous, but I'm still making choices. And that's where the smart sort of happens, or the skill happens, that there's a choice level without getting bogged down in the details of the awareness. Whatever that might be. And that's not necessarily an intuiting thing. An artist or musician or athlete or whatnot with sensing preference is going to be working the same way. And it really is about this element of competence. So that's where we're going to say, like, what does it mean to be civilized in your use of the function? Okay. And that civilized is that you're making choices. You're one-sided when you need to, and you're not one-sided, when it's not appropriate.
Gotcha. So it's really like going through life with the default setting. Whatever ends up coming up for me would be that barbarism we're talking about. But if I make conscious choice to actively, not tie my left hand metaphorically or literally behind my back, I'm choosing to be more civilized. And that's what Jung was talking about here. Choice versus default, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And you can see that even in people's first two functions, the inability to choose something else, just sort of being unconsciously motivated to use even those first two functions, and then it leading to bad things. Like as an ENTP, if I don't have the capacity to not say something cutting to another person, right? Because I have cutting comments come to my mind all the time. And I think it's because like my ENTP nature sees the opportunity for something to be funny, and it also sort of sees a truth about something. It doesn't always read the room right. It doesn't always understand that this might not be the right group, or if I say this, I might really sort of cut somebody to the bone. And I don't, that my intent was never to do that. But so like my brain now has the ability to choose to vet some of those really harsh, though quote unquote funny statements. But it didn't when I was younger. When I was younger, I didn't have the capacity. I just said it and hurt people's feelings and was unliked, right? And I think that kind of sort of growing the lack of barbarism versus civilization is just maybe another way of saying grow in sophistication. Do things that are conducive to building good relationships in society and civilization, as opposed to unconsciously handing yourself over to these functions, even if they're native to you.
Yeah, the example I can think for myself is when I was younger, so I have INTJ preferences, and I mean younger, like even 10 years ago, that when something emotionally uncomfortable would come up, in like socially, like as a discussion interpersonally or whatnot, my reaction is to leave the room. Like I just like literally my body is like, I can't handle this. Like I don't want to listen to this. I don't want to deal with this. I'm not denying the problem. I'm just saying like I physically need to leave the room. And I have found a way since then. I'm like, no, I can actually choose to remain and to engage in a kind of like patient, deep listening, and to allow myself to be in the uncomfortableness. And that's like an example for me. In this case, it's like the third function kind of stuff. But I see that there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think everybody can think of some examples. Yeah.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. So when we move on to the second point, which is this idea of passive versus active use, it seems kind of similar in this idea of barbarism versus civilized. Barbarism being the default setting, civilized being a choice. I mean, you could almost say active and passive is the same thing, but I think the difference here, and you guys can both chime in, but I think the difference here is the first, barbarism versus civilized, that's more about the awareness level. Like my awareness is there, and then am I choosing to do something with that awareness? So it's about awareness and then action, whereas passive and active is more about like I'm already aware, I have the ability to use the function, or I'm active in using it, or I'm able to use it, but is it actively used or passively used? And maybe you
right. So that's So that's it. So an example that's really plagued the type community for decades was the definition of sensing, and this is very much outside of what Jung wrote about and intended for the Myers-Briggs type community, especially in the 70s, 80s, and even going into the 90s. They kept describing sensing as taking in information through the five senses. And I'm thinking like, I know ESFPs and ESTPs, and although they're doing that, that really doesn't describe them. Because what happened is the definitions got very stuck on this passive use, like this passive engagement of a process. And it really ended up creating like a very shallow experience. And people say, well, of course, like anybody can do that. If introverted sensing is just about recalling the past, then gosh, anybody can do that. But, what does the active use look like? It's quite different. So for extroverted sensing, basic, or what I call basic use, but passive use, is something like notice sensory data in the environment. And for SP types, that's often something moving, where something is very relevant, eye-catching, stimulating. And then the advanced use is trusting your instincts and taking action relevant to the moment and the current context. So that's like way at the other end. It's like saying, I'm so familiar with the sensory data, I'm paying attention to that, and I'm so familiar with this particular context that I'm in that, I trust my instincts. I trust being able to take action, and it's going to be relevant, and it's going to have impact, and it's going to work out. And so there's like a very different take on it. And that's, I really, as going through all 8 of the sort of functional types, what we find is this really big distinction sometimes. And I believe almost like most people can do most of the functions in a basic or passive way. But when it comes to, we might even make it say, intermediate distinction, advanced distinction, that's more the domain of how well is the function developed. And I think sometimes we can even look at our auxiliary function and be like, well, that's a good point. Like maybe I use it a lot passively, even though it's my preference, and I'm not using it in the active way that I could. And what does that look like? So when I hang around an ENTJ, I'm like, whoa, this guy or girl's like really, really got great use, a very active way of like structuring the environment and forming business deals and like all of this, where I'm just more like, aligning the details and structuring things and laying out templates. And it's a lot more local to me. It's a lot, and everybody sort of learns like, how do you organize, 5 steps on a piece of paper, even if we don't like it.
Yeah, I think that, especially using that concept of sensing as an example of this, it's not that the idea of taking in information with your senses is inaccurate. It's just the absolute first piece of information upon which all of this complexity is built. And taking that same idea to all of the functions, or maybe all of sort of this idea of, judging or perceiving functions, whenever we just get a taste of like sort of its foundational idea, and then we don't have any experiential wisdom that comes along with like observing how we're using it and observing us using them actively, then that means that we generally think that we're quote unquote using a function when really we might just be at its core definition for us. Like we haven't understood everything that comes in with this particular function. And I think the thing that you mentioned, which is how you're getting to a place where you actually are understanding the implications and understanding how complex this can be and understanding all of the different ways that it can show up, is what are the stakes of what is at stake when you're using this function. Anything that's passive is by definition going to be low stakes, right? Like I've heard a lot of INPs say, like, I'm doing a lot of extroverted intuition, I do a lot of internet research, and I'm like, that's a very low stakes way of collecting more data. But if you decide to, say, go travel internationally to get your information, the stakes are much higher now. Now you have to navigate all sorts of like cultural things you're not familiar with. You might throw yourself in a situation where you, first you have to get the like sort of the financial things in order, and then you have to actually get your butt there, and then you have to figure out how you're going to navigate this space, and all of the things that you learn in all of that, because the stakes are much higher, is so much more rich than leaning back and doing internet research. So I think increasing the stakes of when you're using this function is a great way to determine whether or not you're getting the most out of it and getting all of the learning or all the benefits that this function can give you. So that third one we already mentioned, which was production that other people can see. Unless anybody has more on that topic, should I jump to number 4?
Yeah, let's head into number 4, and we have something else to say about 3. Yeah. We can come back.
And this one seems to...
And don't worry, I already added a 7 and 8. So.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah. So number 4, when using that function, it's not working. like the results are not good anymore, or we get results that were unexpected and surprise us. It goes off the rails in some way. And it could be because the context has changed, or as you described, Antonia, the stakes are higher, and there's a qualitative change at some point, like a phase change when the stakes change.
Yeah.
And because of that, what we thought was working is not going to work anymore.
I think this is the thing that I mentioned at the very beginning before we listed them out, which is like there's this moment when it's like it doesn't matter how quote unquote sophisticated I'm using my functions at, they're just sometimes the wrong tool for the job. Like maybe you have explored sort of like the most meat out of these functions, and you get to a place where you're like, okay, I think I understand when this is the right tool for the job and when it isn't. It's almost like a discernment. You start to understand a discernment around these functions and when they are going to be highly supportive, but when they're like maybe the wrong thing, and maybe I need to be looking at other aspects or other tools to be able to solve this challenge.
And it's like in some of the like shamanic drumming work that I've been doing, one of the measures we were taught is like, do you experience joy when you're recalling something or working on something? When is that like aha feeling that comes? And so I think in terms of surprise or disappointment, like there are particular sensations or feelings that we can say, yeah, these are markers that it's not working for us. I mean, frustration, fear, and so on. There's, and conversely, positive ones, like that feeling of accomplishment that can happen when we use something well. And though, it's okay to pay attention to those, I want to say like soft markers, because they really are giving us useful information.
Yeah. I think is it okay if I move on to number 5? Because I think we actually did do a bit of a deep dive on this particular one earlier. Number 4, about it not working anymore. But I love the idea of talking about the distance between the functions. So does everybody feel complete on number 4?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So this idea of distance between functions and closing those gaps, I'd love to hear what you meant by that, Dario, when you listed it out.
Okay. Well, I have to be honest, I'm not the person who came up with this idea. It's somebody else in the type community whose information has escaped me at the moment. And I actually am not particularly fond of his take on Jung. I think it's not really quite on. But his type descriptions are really great, and in my opinion. And the reason is because he really understands a particular principle, which is this distance between the functions. And if the distance is short, imagine like you're trying to coordinate with somebody on a task, and if you're right there in the same room next to each other, like two people in the kitchen, not that there are 10 chefs, but just 2, then, they can usually coordinate pretty well. It's pretty fast and it's pretty easy. When we're trying to coordinate over the internet, or we're trying to coordinate over hundreds of miles away, maybe even blindly, just having a telephone, a payphone, then it's email, then you have to send letters. Like, you can imagine it becomes more and more difficult to coordinate. So what is the distance in space and time, and how they operate? And one way that this might show up that I could relate to, knowing a number of ISFPs, is when their dominant and tertiary functions get too far away from each other, which is inevitable in our development process. So in other words, I mean, that's why it works as well as a type description, because a lot of people have had these feelings where the first and third are really far away. So one is the set of ideals with introverted feeling, that I believe this is important, this is what I'd like to see in the world, so there's evaluation that's happening. And then there's the introverted intuition that can paint, especially in its opposite type style, this very NTJ, like grand, like complex. Wow, it could be like this, and it's going to be amazing, and visualizing it. And there's something almost like both primal and archetypal, the futuristic, like whatever it is. And you take those two functions and you sort of bring them together, and then there's this idealized images, this vision of a perfect utopian situation. And that to get there is so difficult, because then extroverted sensing is like, well, I don't really know how to do anything that's outside of the current context. Like, I can go to the next thing, but extroverted sensing by itself, we're not using that to do this long-term planning. And then ISFP, when they're younger, doesn't really do any kind of long-term planning. They're like, well, what are the steps and the structures and the templates and the processes and the procedures and the rules and the laws and the consequences and feedback loops and all of that stuff, trying to reach this vision and this ideal. And so it becomes what a lot of people end up on the internet talking about, this idea of loops, where the first and third function are strong, and then the distance between them and the second and fourth functions is really, really far. Like, really far. And not only that, the third function itself is sort of primitive in what it comes up with, and is not painting, a sophisticated image of the future. So this person has all of these like internal challenges where there's like pieces on the chessboard, except the chessboard is huge and they're not synchronized at all in space and time. And the machine, so to speak, doesn't work. It can't work because the pieces aren't connected in a way that they can synchronize. And I think all of us can face that in different ways. And it's when we see something, an example could be for ENTP, they're in a situation, they're really excited about an idea, they want to pitch it to some people, they see the potential of, say, raising money or getting involvement with it, but they lack the internal mental model to know how to generate buy-in. Maybe they just never learned any sales techniques or marketing techniques or whatnot. The model isn't there, so the distance between the first and even the second function is just too big. And they can't bridge it. So that's what I mean, like those examples between about closing the distance, and we know we need to keep working on something to the point of getting them to coordinate.
I have this image of a three-legged race in my head. I know there's more functions in our personalities than three, but this idea of, if you ever played the childhood game three-legged race where you tie your leg together with another person's leg, and my right leg might be tied to another person's left leg, and then my left leg, the tied leg with this other person, and then their leg. There's basically, it creates three legs, and we try to race in that fashion as a kid in these children's parties and things that I went to as a kid. And I'm reminded of that. It's almost like when you're doing this, like when you're stretching so far, you're pulling kind of on the other, and you got to pull the others up with you. Otherwise, you're going to outpace. That's the image I have coming up for me. Does that speak to kind of what you're talking about as far as this goes?
Oh yeah, and we know what happens with that, with the whole thing about a sack race or the three-legged race or whatnot. The sack race being just your own 2 feet and how you get those to move together properly. We fall over.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of struggle, and once people fall over, they may never get up in that three-legged race, and then they have to start all over again. Probably in a lot of organizations, a lot of relationships, something works at the beginning, they get out of sync, and then it never really recovers. And that's unfortunate and, probably inevitable. But yeah, I think that's a great metaphor.
I think there's something here too with a level of consciousness involved in closing the gaps of these functions, because I think also sometimes functions get too close together and they almost influence each other in the wrong way.
Create a cartel.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you talked about the first and the third function creating a loop. I mean, in some ways, the distance between them can also be too close together, like in those loops, where they're just sort of feeding off of each other, but not in a healthy way. And then they're creating further distance from that auxiliary function. And everything just seems, quote unquote, too big or too overwhelming in the case of like the ISFP. But there's, of course, versions of this for all the types. And so sometimes the proximity of some functions feels like it's inappropriately close, considering the dynamic you want to create. And so it's really not from how I'm thinking about it right now, it's getting the closeness of the functions right as well. Like which functions need to be close together and which ones need to be integrated together. In the case of that first and second function, like if you're maybe focused on developing the second function for a time, it will feel siloed. it will feel sort of like you're just focusing on it and you're just trying to work on it. And so it will feel like there's a distance. But the better you get at it, the more you realize how handy it is and how practical it is. And then you start weaving it together with your first function or dominant function to a point where eventually you can't see where one begins and the other ends. And actually, sometimes people who are well developed and have good function, like good command of their functions, will sometimes have a harder time understanding other functions, particularly shadow functions, because they're getting the same gain from a combination of those two functions that maybe another function gets all by itself. And so it's almost hard to sort of determine one's type because they're not sure which function they're using when, because sometimes a combination of two almost mirrors what another one looks like or a description of another one.
Yeah, and this really gets at some fundamental things, which are, for example, skill use, and that Jung chose the word functions modeled after the math term function, which like y equals mx plus b. Mm-hmm. That any numbers can be plugged into the set of relationships, this set of variables, and then you can churn out something. And because he traveled internationally and was very interested in this anthropological and literary and philosophical perspectives, that he didn't want to say like introverted thinking is about like, working in technology or something like that. That's a very behavioralist perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think people in the type community, amateurs who've gone down that route and like really try and characterize it in terms of skills, I mean, that has its benefits, but it's just like you should call them skills, and that it really is independent. One can use introverted thinking for being a therapist, being an artist, being an engineer, like all of those things are certainly possible. And in terms of distance, and I think this is another question, is some people ask like, well, why are there only 16 types? Like, couldn't somebody be like an NEFE type? Like, the person is extroverted and they have a judging function and a perceiving function. Like, isn't that enough? And I think it's important to remember that Isabel Myers developed the Myers-Briggs types, the 16, as a prescriptive model. That she saw most people are not going to be doing this like depth psychology work, going into a therapist, especially in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, were not things that anything but a tiny, tiny minority of the population did. And she's like, what leads to the most balance in a person's life? Well, this so-called like first and second function, so that ENTP, there is this like NETI, and yeah, there can be problems with it, but developmentally, like it creates the most solid foundation to work from. As opposed to saying like, describing every type in terms of a loop or something like that is not healthy. Mm-hmm. So I think just for people listening out there who have probably been exposed to some type stuff on the internet, that there are actually very thoughtful reasons, just because something happened before the internet was invented or before your parents were born, that's okay. Still a lot of thought went into why are we going to describe it this way instead of that way. And it really was meant to encourage the most balance in people's lives and paint this like sort of heroic, maybe overly positive picture, but to encourage it. And so, yeah, I agree. Like sometimes too close it is just as bad as too far.
Mm. Yeah.
So as we move on to the next point, we're talking about the facets of these functions, right? You mentioned this idea of, I guess, seeing all the parts of it, utilizing the full expression of it is what I hear from that, that note, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And I believe we can sort of approach this in two ways. One is we can just sort of make a list in a sense. So Gary and Margaret Hartzler, who've been around in the type community for half a century, they're not on the internet in any way as far as I know, but they really talk about these different facets of type, and in a way, like say for extroverted sensing, it's going to be alertness with the senses, it's going to be quick acting, having skill in a crisis, attending to risk and reward, wanting to keep things simple. So those are like different qualities, different characteristics. We might want to use the term traits, although I avoid that word. And the question is like, for somebody who, say, have the extroverted sensing as second or third, do they have, say, the alert senses part, and maybe even the quick acting, but they're not really attending to risk and reward. And so I think especially when something is in the third position, it's like, oh yeah, like I'm only really using half of the function. And gee, like what's the other half? And just being able to see that. So I think that's one way to look at it. The other way is the way that I see, like, a number of people have sort of accidentally arrived at, independently, it seems, more or less. And it goes by different names. I found it personally through looking at brain imaging data and paying attention to people's demographics at the same time. So, like, what's the person's general professional area? Are they in science and technology or business or law, or are they an artist or in social service or humanities or whatever it is? Also male and female. So sometimes people have called these two sides of each function or process like plus and minus, or masculine, feminine. We could just say yin and yang, and that would probably do it too. I say analytic and holistic because I found that when I looked at people's brains, say like 60 ENFPs, they don't all look the same. In fact, I would be really concerned and suspicious if they did. What I did find is that if I separated out people into demographic groups, like separate into male, female, then separate out into more analytic career areas like STEM, law, business, accounting, that kind of thing, or more holistic careers, the arts, humanities, social service. What I found is that I'm like, oh, okay, now all of a sudden this confusion of different brain wiring options really reduces to these clear patterns. And if we just even pay attention to those patterns, and as I look through it, I see, oh yeah, like I really do the sort of like what I would call analytic, but other people might call masculine version. That doesn't mean only males do it. This is just like in a Jungian sense, not in a gender, even a gendered sense.
Sure.
Version of introverted intuiting. And for me, that was like my go-to introverted intuiting for 45 years. And that was literally half the picture. And I was sort of aware there's like vaguely this other side to it, that there's this holistic version of NI, but it's not something I took seriously or really knew how to develop. I had some bad experiences with it. I thought it was sort of woo-woo or, just weird, unproductive. Because I was also, judging myself at the same time. I mean, who does that? And at the same time, I also saw with extroverted thinking, I actually do understand and can use sort of both versions, a holistic and analytic extroverted thinking. I have more preference for one. And then why don't I do the other? It's a little bit is lack of skill, but a lot of it is lack of opportunity. So I don't want people to think like, oh, well, this is wired into me or something. That it really is about creating or pursuing opportunities in life. Even with our own dominant function, we can look and see like, oh yeah, there's like the other side of the coin. And it's the same coin, but it's stamped with something completely different. It works a different way, and maybe I can do that too. And actually, you can.
I think this is a good place to encourage people to get their hands on a copy of your book called The Magic Diamond, which is a book you published this year that has a list of characteristics that are aligned with each of the cognitive functions, and whether or not a person is using it more in an analytical way versus a holistic way. And we've kind of hinted about this in the podcast, in other episodes, that getting an idea of those two components is a way to maybe reevaluate your relationship with even functions that you feel like you've been developing for decades. Like you mentioned, you were leaving money on the table because you were only using the analytic version of introverted intuition. And when I went through the list of my functions, I realized that I highly favor the holistic versions of them, and probably in part because of potentially my gender and what's been encouraged, but also a lot of training. And so I'm now looking at these more analytic versions of them and understanding how they could be really helpful for me. So I think it's a great idea for you, the listener, to pick up a copy so that you can look at these two, compare, contrast them, and see if, maybe you've moved on to developing other functions in your stack, but there could be opportunities to get even better at the other flavor of your dominant and auxiliary function.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that. So that's the Magic Diamond 8 Paths, Jung's 8 Paths for self-coaching. I say self-coaching because not everybody has the time and money to do like full-time coaching at, $150 an hour or whatever it is, and just wanting to have packets there. And if you are a coach, there's sort of these pre-made packets embedded in the book to use. And then there are some extra topics, just like this one, that sort of I weave in there along with the neuroscience and the type descriptions and all of that. What else you said too about, I said on the one hand, the definitions aren't meant to be like, just because I'm male doesn't mean I'm supposed to be using the masculine version of a function or say the analytic version. I don't want to dismiss at the same time the impact that socialization has and social pressure. And I remember growing up, and I'm looking at extroverted sensing, which is my inferior function, and the two versions of that, like this sort of like absorbing sensory experiences, enjoying life's pleasures, what I call the sensate. It could be an aesthetate version of SE. And then there's this like mover, physically active, move others, that has a more aggressive style to it. And I constantly received feedback as a teenager that this mover SE was bad, wrong, should not do it. And of course, all of our society is sort of, unless you're in sports or something like that, it can be quite dangerous to your life and to your career to use this more like analytic version of SE, which is unfortunate in a way.
Yeah.
That sometimes there are those pressures in the same, the expectation that a woman is supposed to be doing this like maintaining hearth and home style of introverted sensing. And I'm like, no, there's, it's, so I don't want to discount that. And that may actually be one of the reasons why people may think, especially intuiting types, oh no, I'm not subjected to, or, I'm above socialization, I'm aware of it. And I'm like, oh, it goes so deep, and so that's really why it's great to have a table in front of us to point out and then to hear people's stories around it.
Yeah. One of the most developed things you can do is merely become conscious of just how much you are programmed by the outside world. It's not, I don't know if anybody fully transcends it unless they're, at the top of a mountain meditating all the time. But even my observations about the function of introverted thinking, man, I got so punished for using the analytical version. And I think that this has to do with me being a woman, very much so. But I got so punished for it, and I found that the only way I could use it was the holistic version, and then I wouldn't get as dogpiled. And so there was a lot of socialization pushing me towards that, in order to have any sort of validation or patting on the head growing up. And so now, I think a big game changer was going, oh, there's another side to this. There's a side that doesn't look as socially acceptable, but it's also very powerful and kind of necessary. So I think you're totally right. We are almost always blind to how much we're being socialized into how we're using these functions. All right.
So,
yeah.
Okay, I think we need to pause right here because we're getting into a lot of stuff that's going to go forever if we keep going here. Let's stop here and do the second part in the next episode, if you guys are cool with that. If you've been listening along, let's just pause here for a moment. If you've been listening along, we want to hear from you. What's been coming up for you so far in this conversation? As you're listening through, knowing when to move forward in your type development, we'd love for you to come over to personalityhacker.com and leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story about what's coming up for you as you listen through this conversation.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. I highly recommend picking up a copy of Dr. Dario Nardi's book, The Magic Diamond. It's a great book. I've been through it and done workshops on it, and I highly recommend you pick up a copy, particularly if you're looking at type through the lens of development and self-coaching. And of course, at Personality Hacker, we also have a suite of programs that are focused on personal growth through the lens of personality psychology. So if that's interesting to you, head over to personalityhacker.com, look at our catalog, and see if there's a personal growth program tailored for you.
So we're excited to have Dr. Nardi on the next episode to continue this conversation. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I am Dario Nardi.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.